Fix your target. Give him every inch of cold steel.
50,000 Americans served the British in one capacity or another.
From America, sir.
From Virginia.
Captain Leroy is one of those brave American loyalists who refuse to accept the ravages of democracy.
Today, we're talking about the good Americans. Yep, those who stayed loyal to the crown.
There's some fascinating tales, but the victors are the ones who write the history of the war.
Lieutenant General James Robertson, a senior British general in America, said that it was always his intention to subdue the bad Americans with the good Americans. Well, he was referring to these brave loyalists, the men who of course knew right from wrong and respected their king. The good guys who ignored those dastardly splitters. Yes. But sadly, some people can't be helped, and our cousins from across the pond did eventually go their own way. I don't think it's worked out well for them. Now, before some rather earnest Americans berate me in the comments, that's a joke. See, if you'd have stayed with us, you would have had our sarcastic sense of humour. But joking aside, if you can tell me how to get an American passport for me and my family, I'll be over in a heartbeat.
Oh, say can you see?
Anyway, enough of the japes. Today I'm joined by a fantastic historian, Todd Bracestead. Yes, he is an American, and he really knows his stuff about the Loyalist troops of the American Revolution. I started off by asking him if there was a history of locally raised units fighting alongside the British in the Americas.
There was a tradition of Americans fighting for the British. The British Army has always traditionally been small. Great Britain's an island. You need a big navy. You don't need a big standing army. They're expensive. So when wars happen, you raise troops, and you raise troops where the battles are. So the French and Indian War and the previous colonial wars here in America, the British had always raised troops. And during the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War in Europe, they looked upon the provinces to raise provincial regiments. And of course, they flooded the provinces later on with money. So yes, there was this tradition, and it was very much needed by the British. There were at least as many, and probably more, American troops fighting for the British in the French and Indian War than there were British troops over here. They could not have done it without them.
As a percentage, what sort of numbers of people in the 13 colonies at the outbreak of the revolution would have considered themselves loyalists? Or, how many still supported the crown, would you say?
One of the biggest misquotes of that period is people who say 1/3 were loyalists, 1/3 were rebels, 1/3 didn't care, and attribute it to John Adams. That is not a quote concerning the American Revolution. What Adams was talking about was the later war between England and France. That became the quasi-war with the United States. 1/3 of the people supported England, 1/3 supported France, and 1/3 really didn't care. So that's what Adams was referring to, not the American Revolution. Most of America was not occupied by the British. The British Army, is probably well aware, was very small at the outbreak of the American Revolution, and only in a couple of cities. So the vast continent had no British presence whatsoever, other than a few customs officials or whatnot. So it's really impossible to say what percentage, because if you were in an area that had a newfangled committee of safety and their own militia, you're not walking into a tavern with an "I love King George" pin on you. That's a recipe for disaster. So you keep your views quiet. If a British army enters your neighborhood, you could start huzzahing for King George, but odds are, a British army is never going to get to your neighborhood. So you keep your views quiet. If you're called up to serve in the local militia, if you don't want to do that, you hire a substitute who goes and serves for you, so you can later claim you never took up arms against the British. So it's really hard to say. Now, that being said, one of the generally accepted percentages is 20%. Now, if you look at the population of America, that's about 3 million people, black and white. So you're dealing with about 600,000 people. the vast majority of whom did not go to settle elsewhere after the time of the Revolution. They either were dead or had made their peace with the new country, one way or the other.
And so at the beginning of the American Revolution, then, obviously with this history of recruiting local militia, I understand units were raised where they called provincials. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Provincials is an establishment, whereas the militia, everyone has to serve in between the ages of 16 and 50 or 60. Those are your local guys called up for brief amounts of service. Provincials were what you could consider American regulars fighting for the British. At the time of the Revolution, their term of service was different than that of the French and Indian War. They were to serve either 2 or 3 years, or for the duration of the war. Now, that wording, of course, gets a little dicey when a soldier looks at it and goes, "Oh, I served my 2 or 3 years. I can be discharged now." No, 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 no. You serve for the duration of the war, and provincials would receive the same pay, rations, quality of clothing, arms, accoutrements, discipline, ration, all the same stuff of a British regular. They were not to serve outside of North America. They would also be commissioned by the commander-in-chief of the army in America. Only the king can raise a new British regiment, a regular British regiment, but the commander-in-chief of the army in America or the Northern Army in Canada could raise as many provincial troops as he wanted or as he could. So the 2 first provincial regiments were actually raised or authorized to be raised before the first shot at Lexington and Concord, which is something people don't realize. 2 British officers were in England and both received authorization to go to America and raise regiments there. They didn't arrive until after the fighting had broken out, but the British had foreseen that they would need that sort of help. The British Army, again, had a lot of area to cover: the Mediterranean, India, the West Indies, America itself, not to mention, Europe. So that's a lot of area for not a lot of guys. So you're going to need more people no matter what. Once that first shot is fired, people always say, why did the British hire Hessians? They had to. They needed the extra manpower. It takes time, and certainly the British did it, but it takes time to raise new regiments in Great Britain. And they did during the course of the war, but it's not a huge population, and the commitments around the world were just such that you needed to raise men everywhere. And why not utilize America? Not everybody is in revolt, and some of these people have a history of serving in the French and Indian War. And if we just make them serviceable, if we can just train them, make them useful, that helps our force.
Where were the first regiments raised, and then what sort of training would they have had, and what sort of size of units are we talking?
The British raised provincial regiments to be roughly the same size, or one of them at least, to be the same size as British regiments, depending on what year of the war, either 500 or 700 men, but generally 500 men for the sake of argument. The first regiments that were authorized were where the British controlled areas: Boston and Nova Scotia and Quebec. Those were raised by the commanders-in-chief there, utilizing people that they considered trustworthy. Interestingly, primarily Highlanders, Scots, the Royal Highland immigrants. These were one of the 2 regiments authorized to be raised before the Revolution broke out. The other one being the Royal Fencible Americans, fencible being a word to denote local service only. Britain had a lot of fencible regiments in Great Britain itself, and this was going to be one for America, and that was raised by Joseph Gorham in Nova Scotia. The raising of men could only really take place within British lines. The British never really fully comprehended how dangerous it was to recruit men outside of the lines. If you go around with a warrant saying, you're going to get a commission for enlisting 35 men to serve King George, You get captured with that, the local committee of safety is going to throw you in jail and most likely hang you. So they wish to avoid that at all costs, and I can't blame them. But the training part, and that's a great question. The training part was really difficult because these folks are on the lines immediately. In England, you have recruit depots, regiments. You don't join the army, you join a regiment. And those regiments have their own depots where they can train a recruit how to march, how to wear their clothing, how to wear their accoutrements, how to fire, all that sort of stuff before they get sent to America or wherever they're going. Sometimes that could be weeks, oftentimes months. So they had that opportunity to be disciplined before actually being on campaign or seeing service. With provincial units or any loyalist unit, they're being raised where the fighting is. So you can enlist in a provincial regiment on, say, January 3rd, and you can be in battle January 4th. And that actually happened on several occasions.
Wow.
Yes. When I give a lecture, I always ask, if there were people in the audience who served in the military. And, if they went through basic training. And I say, well, imagine you didn't go to basic training. You were just given a uniform or a rifle, or sometimes not given a uniform and told, okay, and you're going out into battle tomorrow, learn along the way. And they wondered why they took such horrific casualties. You have to learn everything about being a soldier, and that includes your officers. These are people who were generally farmers. They became officers by recruiting men, not by their military knowledge. If you could recruit 30 guys, 35 guys, you're a captain. You recruit 17 guys, 18 guys, you're a lieutenant. That's a pretty good deal. But it doesn't mean that you know how to be a captain or how to be a lieutenant. There's published works, Symes and Cuthbertson and whatnot, that you're going to try and buy and learn along the way, learn how the interior economy of a regiment works. But one of the things the British did to try and alleviate that was promote deserving sergeants from British regiments into being officers in provincial regiments, especially to be adjutants.
You look old for a lieutenant.
I came from the ranks, sir.
You mean you're not a gentleman?
No, sir.
By God, Sharp, this will not do.
That was the professional rank, learning how somebody who knew the paperwork, the drill, what it took to run a regiment, even though, there were people above him. So you'd take a sergeant from, the 35th Regiment of Foot, and you plug him into a provincial regiment as an adjutant and a lieutenant or something like that. His job is really to teach the officers and the men how to be soldiers so they can, they'll have a chance. It really took a couple of years to get to that sort of professionalism. But, and certainly the British were often less than understanding about that in the beginning of the war. As the war went on, of course, they needed those regiments because the war was not just confined to the New York area. It was all over the place, Virginia and Georgia and South Carolina, North Carolina. You needed more and more troops, and provincial units really had to take on greater responsibilities, and their officers had to take on greater responsibilities.
We're talking of officers. One of my interests is the Peninsular War during the Napoleonic Wars, and the way that often those officers who couldn't afford their next step in promotion was they would be transferred to, say, the Portuguese army, for example, and they'd get a jump in rank and pay. Did that happen here? Were there regulars who were transferring to these loyalist regiments in order to get, a jump in rank? Was that happening?
Absolutely. And if you had a promising young officer who was a lieutenant or a captain, the odds of him being advanced within the British Army to major, lieutenant colonel, where he could actually command more than just a company, say, was very time consuming, and it could take the course of a war to even happen. And the British recognized this with such people as John Graves Simcoe and Bannister Tarleton, Francis Lord Rawdon. These were all young officers, captains, or lower, who were viewed as having very promising careers ahead of them, were very zealous. Anybody who had a pen and ink, you could write to the commander-in-chief and say, I've got a plan. And you get the notice of the commander-in-chief, and you pull a few strings, and all of a sudden you go from being the captain of the Grenadier Company of the 40th, which John Graves Simcoe was, to the commander, a lieutenant colonel of the Queen's Rangers. You're Bannister Tarleton, you're a cornet in the Light Dragoons. Boom, all of a sudden you're lieutenant colonel of the British Legion. Francis Lord Rawdon started the war as a lieutenant in the 5th, ended up in 1781 as a brigadier general. So these were all people, as examples, who were given provincial regiments to command. Rawdon himself raised some of his men, but Simcoe, for the most part, was given a regiment. Tarleton put his together from other units that had been raised. They didn't like, say, the Americans who commanded them. And that caused a lot of resentment among loyalists because they had enlisted under certain officers, and now those officers are gone, and they've got British commanding officers above them. While the British thought them more capable, and oftentimes certainly they were, there was still that level of disappointment or resentment there. These weren't the people I enlisted under, and all of a sudden I've got somebody from another country commanding me.
So a quick break for some housekeeping, guys. If you want to sign up for my mailing list, get your monthly newsletter and a free copy of my ebook all about the Battle of Isandlwana, then please go over to redcoathistory.com/newsletter, fill out your details, and I'll send those over. Alternatively, you can join my Patreon page. That's patreon.com/redcoathistory. For $5 a month, you'll get early access to all of my films and podcasts, and you can join the debates that we have over there. And then finally, and just quickly, I want to talk about the Victorian Military Society, or VMS, which celebrates its Golden Jubilee this year. It was founded in 1974 to foster interest in military aspects of the Victorian period. When you join the VMS, you get the brilliant magazine Soldiers of the Queen. Now, they've got a big event coming up on Saturday the 14th of September. That's called Army, Empire and Cinema, and it's happening at the National Army Museum in London. It marks the 50th anniversary of the founding of the VMS and the 60th anniversary of the premiere of the film Zulu. Yep, you all know I love that film. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, just go to victorianmilitary.org and then you can follow the links to sign up for the VMS or to get tickets for their 50th anniversary event. In the course of your research, you've read thousands of letters, manuscripts, everything else. I know it's hard to kind of sum all this up in a short answer, but give us a sense of what sort of men have you discovered in those manuscripts? What sort of people are we talking about? The lower level guys, at the lower levels, private soldiers, junior NCOs, that sort of thing.
It runs the gamut, as pretty much any, it's a reflection of any army. The Continental Army, the British Army, you get the whole spectrum of people. You get the good, you get the bad, you get the squishy middle. So these were normal people who, living their lives in 1775, who, all of a sudden now the world's turned upside down and, they have to become soldiers. And one of the interesting things I don't think a lot of people realize is once you decided to be a soldier for, say, the British or Washington, it didn't mean that's necessarily how you ended the war. A lot of folks, and we're talking thousands, changed sides. Obviously, Benedict Arnold is well known, but there were thousands of deserters and prisoners taken by both sides who enlisted with either the side they deserted to or the side that had captured them. And sometimes you can say, well, prisoners enlisting just to try to facilitate his escape back to his own side. And certainly that happened to some degree. But a lot of those guys stayed on their new side and fought well. and not just enlisted men, but officers as well. And that's a fascinating. I tell people, picture, watching the news one day and seeing that 600 men from the 82nd Airborne deserted to the Taliban, and were now attacking Kandahar. Completely inconceivable. But there were whole regiments of these people raised. My favorite Loyalist regiment, simply for its name, was the Royal American Reformees. I pictured people in orange jumpsuits along the side of a highway picking up trash. Um, but they were commanded by a former New York Continental Army colonel. So it's amazing that it was a real mishmash of people. You had people who were very your true believers. Those who were King George all the way. People from circumstance. I just wanted to maintain my loyalty to the British. I just wanted to stay home and do things, and they wouldn't let me. James Moody, one of the most famous loyalists from here in New Jersey, described himself in the winter of 76, 77 as a peaceful, plain, contented farmer. He said when all the cry was join or die, Mr. Moody desired neither. And he said he was just tending his fields one day when they were coming to force him into the rebel militia, and started firing at him when he started to walk away from them, and ran off, collected 73 of his friends from Sussex County, New Jersey, and joined the British. He ended up as a lieutenant in the New Jersey Volunteers, and he too wrote a book at the end of the war. He did fascinating things, including attempted to steal the papers of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia in October and November of 1781. Became an incredible spy and whatnot. So you had people who were all into the spectrum, but there's some fascinating tales. But the victors are the ones who write the history of the war, and a lot of loyalist stuff is gone out there, but it doesn't get the traction, obviously, of the victor.
And talking of that, then, how are loyalists now perceived in these conversations in America now? Like, you obviously have gone very, very deep into this subject, and you speak with all sorts of people with a love for the history of this era. Are loyalists seen as, quote unquote, bad guys, traitors, or do people appreciate that it was a very complicated time and that they're an important part of the history and should be respected?
The answer to that is C, all of the above. Some people do actually want to be more inclusive, and there's other folks who are very they learned in grade school 40 years ago that loyalists were bad people, and that is their level of understanding of it, and don't tell them otherwise. So with reenacting, it's a little easier. A lot of my reenactment group per se wears green uniforms, which was the clothing they wore in 1777. And one of the reasons we chose that period was because it's not red and it's not blue. And if you grow up here in America, British wear red, Continentals wear blue, and that's the end of the story. And all of a sudden there's these people in green there. Well, who were those people? And it makes them come up to it and ask, who are you? And get a chance to explain who the loyalists were. Then they'll get a bit of an understanding of it. But there's folks who are always going to consider loyalists were just bad people. And others who are going to now see them as perhaps something better. And of course, when you cross the border into Canada, it's the United Empire Loyalist Association of Canada up there, which is the organization of their descendants.
How important to the war effort did these loyalist units become? And how do you think they were perceived by the British sort of senior officers? Were they seen as a safe pair of hands, or were they always treated as a B team?
Depending on the regiments, and who the British officers were and who the provincial officers were. In the beginning, they weren't trusted very much. They weren't thought of very much until October of 1778. Now, what happened in October of 78? The British sent away their offensive capability from New York to go serve in the West Indies because of the French. And all of a sudden now your percentage of the army that's left in New York is much greater with provincials than British. And you have to use these people. When the British sent in the expedition right after that to go take Savannah, Georgia, they sent one British regiment, the 71st Highlanders, 2 Hessian regiments, and 4 provincial battalions to go take Savannah. This, as the war progressed, particularly in the South, when every commander in the South kept crying for reinforcements, more times than not, they were getting provincials in greater numbers from New York, until there were hardly any provincials left in New York. Most were serving in the South, or garrisons up in Canada, or Nova Scotia, or Pensacola, or St. Augustine. Jamaica, there were troops raised to serve not only in Jamaica, but to raid the Spanish Main, Central America, Honduras, Nicaragua. The British would view the regiments by their commanders. This is the anniversary that we just passed of the Siege of 96. 96 was actually the name of a town in South Carolina. Don't ask why. And the garrison there was primarily from the North, a battalion of New Jersey Volunteers and a battalion of Delancey's Brigade, provincials from up here, plus some South Carolina militia. And the British trusted that because of their commanders, Isaac Allen and John Harris Kruger, as people they could trust. Whether or not they trusted the troops under them was a direct bearing of who their commanders were. Of course, they loved the regiments commanded by British officers like the Queen's Rangers and the Legion and the Volunteers of Ireland. Those were their go-to favorites. But they were not the majority of the provincials. Those were guys like the Loyal American Regiment and the King's American Regiment, the Prince of Wales American Volunteers. Those were your standard provincial units, the New Jersey Volunteers. Those were the guys who did the bulk of the fighting, served in the bulk of the places, and got the least of the glory.
What happened to most of these units and to most of the personnel who served in them at the end of the war?
Interestingly, when these folks enlisted in the first place, the great bounty for enlisting wasn't so much the coin or the actual bounty money you got for enlisting. It was the promise of free land at the end of your enlistment. A lot of common soldiers were laborers. They were not land owners, or they had come from their father's farms. In the expectation that one day they would own some of that land. But here the British are promising you free land at the end of the war. Now, that land was going to be in the province of New York. And of course, at the end of the war, the British were no longer in a position to give away the land of New York. And so, but they were still on the hook to give away this land. And the British then extended it to every loyalist, whether they served in the military or not. But the military ones would get land based on their rank. Plus how many dependents you had, a wife and children. So each common private soldier was going to get 100 acres of land, plus 50 acres for his wife and 50 acres for each child. Now, if you're so if you're an officer, you could get 500 acres or 750 acres or even 1,000 acres based on your rank. So you can become a pretty good landowner. Now, where was that land going to be? And it's what's now modern Canada. Canada in the 18th century sense was only the province of Quebec, which extended all the way out to Michigan out there. But the rest of British North America was primarily Nova Scotia, which really was just one of the American colonies. It didn't rebel. Same for East Florida and West Florida. Well, Spain was going to get East Florida and West Florida, but the Americans were not going to get Canada. They would get, Detroit and Michigan and whatnot, but not the other side of the lakes. And so the British were going to disband all these units up there. For the guys serving in Jamaica, They could go to Nova Scotia, or they could stay on Jamaica, some of the islands down there, Bermuda, New Providence, those sorts of things would take in people. Some would go to England, but the bulk would go to what became the province of Upper Canada, Ontario, or Nova Scotia, which in 1784 was divided into two. New Brunswick in the west, Nova Scotia in the east. The only problem with that was it was September and October of 1783 when the bulk of these troops and civilians got up there. And, as I tell people, there's a reason you don't see tourism commercials for Nova Scotia in January. It is not hospitable. It is not desirable. And in a more practical sense, the British did not anticipate that tens of thousands of people would want to go. They did not ever really understand the level of hostility of their rebel neighbors towards them. They simply thought, well, they'll just go home. Most of these folks didn't have a home to go back to. One of the ways the states paid for their war effort was the confiscation of Loyalist property. So particularly of officers. So they had nowhere to go. And all of a sudden you have tens of thousands of people needing their free land, and they're not getting there until what really is the onset of winter. And the big impediment is, what can you do? What do you need to do before you give away land? You need to survey it. Otherwise, what's Chris's land? What's Todd's land? Where's the boundaries? Who gets that land? You have all these people clamoring for, and guess what? They all want the best land. Well, who saw that coming? And how do you distribute the land once it's surveyed fairly? Well, they ended up drawing lots by number out of a hat for the most part. And some of that land was good, some less than good. And of course, the people who got the less than good land complained, and their records are voluminous in the archives today, saying, I don't like my land. It's rocky. I can't grow anything on it. I want some good land. And, so now they have to find Fred some good land somewhere. And it didn't just take years, it took decades before everything got straightened out. You'll still see people requesting land in archives collections into the 1790s or even after the turn of the 19th century.
Is there anything else you think I should ask you, or something else you'd like to talk about? Maybe I've missed an obvious question, or something that you think we really should talk about.
I guess the salient point to keep in mind is that these forces did number in the thousands. I would probably guess that 50,000 Americans served the British in one capacity or another, whether in regular regiments, provincial regiments, whether in the militia, even in the British Army itself. The Adjutant General of the British Army in America after John Andre was Oliver Delancey Jr. He was a New Yorker. And one of the others that he had replaced was Stephen Kemble, a New Jerseyan. And in the Royal Navy, on privateers, in the civil branches, there were thousands of these people. The British could not have fought the war without the aid of these tens of thousands of Americans. So it's a little told story. If people want to learn more, they can look up articles I've written with Journal of the American Revolution, allthingsliberty.com, or perhaps go to my website, royalprovincial.com.
Now, I thought that interview was so good. We've got 3 short spin-offs coming up over the next couple of months. We're going to do episodes on Tarleton, Simcoe and Patrick Ferguson, those great leaders of Loyalist units. You don't want to miss that. I'll be back next week with another fascinating slice of British military history. I'll see you then.